Well, good morning, Wrecker.
Hey Nick, how you doing?
I'm pretty good. I've been spending a lot of my time. Apparently, I was invited to do this editorial for MIS Quarterly with.
Wait, are you using apparently in the wrong sense? How can you be apparently be invited? You're invited or you're
Whatever.
not invited. You can't be apparently invited.
I'm humbled by my invitation to
Oh, you were
to
humbled.
I was humbled by an invitation to anyway, I'm doing this editorial. We did this paper a few years back in information systems research on data-driven computationally intensive theory development, and it's gotten some traction. And Andrew put us together with Shayla Miranda to do this editorial, and I've been thinking a lot about this. We had a session with editors last week at MISQ, and we've been thinking. You were there.
Yep.
And we're reading a lot about philosophy of science, right? So just to really make sure, because we want to figure out. And by the way, if there's going to be a potential authors session, so we'll put the link to the potential. You have to register for this if you want to learn how to maybe publish this method. But it's kind of and we'll have a future podcast maybe about the method. But what I've been doing during this, is we need to think about things like generalizability. We need to think about validity. Some of the old, and so I'm back reading some of the basic stuff on the case study method. And,
Oh yeah.
particularly in IS research, what I find is most of what we have when we talk about methods, kind of from this meta level, it kind of brings up the positivist versus interpretivist distinction. So you're familiar with this distinction, of course, right? And I guess in a nutshell, positivists are they're the ones who are like, hey, there are certain things we can know about the world. Let's set up some tests about what we can know in the world, and then let's move on from there, right? And then the interpretivists are like, well, wait a second. So much of the world is mediated by our language and our understanding and our perspective, and we can't somehow disassociate what we know from our perspectives and from the perspectives of those people in social reality, right? So they tend to focus more on the interpretation and the context, and then the positivists tend to focus more on the regularities across contexts and really oftentimes their statistical relationship with each other, right?
So wait, I think you're blurring together a lot of things. So I think this question is differentiation between positivism and interpretivism does come up, especially when junior scholars do. Like when I see a lot of people that write their very first paper and they spend literally out of the 6 pages they get for their research in progress papers, they spend 1 page on clarifying their philosophical stance towards the research, and very often they get it wrong, I think.
But that's only Europeans. Yeah. So Americans don't. Because we're all positivists, right? And Europeans do, because a lot of times they're taking a critical position. As a matter of fact, I talked to someone who's a professor now in European university, and she told me, and I think she was just finishing her PhD at the time, that of course you have to point out your epistemological position in the course of writing, or else, how can you say anything without pointing out your epistemological position? So I think that's a European thing.
I've heard this a lot too, that people are being told that this must be a part of any academic conversation, must be part of a paper, it must be part of your thesis, that you literally have that section where you clarify your own stance. I'm not sure where that comes from, but it's certainly a thing. I agree with you. So one question before we get into the depth of this. So here's sometimes when I try to explain it to students, right? So grad students that are sort of getting exposed to research. So what I often say about positivism and interpretivism, and sort of try to make it tangible to business or sort of IS people, and say like, okay, think about an organization. What is that? So a positivist would say, well, there's this thing out there that's an organization. I can measure it by certain metrics, like I can look at the size or the volume, whatever else, the number of buildings, these sorts of things. And an interpretivist would say, hang on a second, what exactly is it that you mean with the word organization? Let's talk about that first, because an organization is whatever we ascribe to that term. So an organization could be, I don't know, a network. It could be everyone in a building. It could be everyone that has an email with the name on it or whatever, right? Would you agree with this? That's a way to look at this, positivist versus interpretive?
I guess that may help. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, I mean, it's awful, but I think that it arose. All right, so here's kind of my take, and this is probably a totally a U.S. centric position, right? And that's that uh, quantitative analysis is the key in the United States, and it was always the key in the United States, right? So you're going back to sociology in the 1950s, post World War II, right? It was all quantitative analysis. That's what people were doing, and they made a lot of assumptions about regularities. They would measure things in kind of like their lowest common denominator, even if it was a survey, right? What you're doing is you're imagining that there is something out there, like let's say, let's say, well, let's pick something like culture or trust. That there is something called trust, and that you can measure it. And then you come up with surveys to measure this thing called trust. And then you want to look at what influence trust has on your culture. So you have to assume, number one, that there is something called trust. And then you have to assume that you can measure it and that it's stable enough and that you can find regularity. So if we establish this construct across contexts, we can measure it, we can get at it. If you're talking about just financial performance or something like that, it's easier to measure because it's already evident in the world. When you start abstracting up to concepts, you make that and then what happened is, I guess in the 60s and 70s, people started saying, well, you're abstracting up into this concept of trust. And trust means different things to different people. So we're less pointing out and you're over generalizing. You're making too many hand wavy assertions that don't have localized, particularized application anymore. So come on, let's go to the unique situations. Let's go to the real world and let's see what's actually happening, because your broad generalities are too much, right? And that's what created the interpretive kind of argument in organizational research anyway.
And I think that applies to my example with the organization as well. And a positive would say, okay, I'm doing an organization level survey and I need to account for the fact they're a different organization. Let's say they have organizational size, and it could be large, medium, small. And let's say I use an indicator such as a number of employees. Yeah, and that speaks to your regularities and so forth, because you put every organization out there into 3 buckets: small, medium, large, based on number of employees. And then you find regularities such as financial performance of large versus medium versus small organizations. That's what the positivist would do. The interpretive would say, hang on, an organization, it depends what you mean. Why is this organization large just because there's more people? To this other person over here, that might not be an organization whatsoever, right? And then I always give my example of myself and say, like, who am I? I'm with the University of Hamburg, but the reality is I'm in my home, exactly. Right now. I'm not in the building. I don't know how many people there are. And even if, what about people that come in and lecture at the University of Hamburg, but are not paid by the university? So you can look at this in very different ways. And that's what an interpretive person would do. We would say, like, what is an organization? How do we define that? What's the meaning of that word? And that then defines what that concept is.
And it emphasizes variety, right? And it emphasizes localization, context, variety. And really what happened is this whole organizational, we started with positivism. Then there was like this interpretive kind of corrective, really mirrors philosophy. And you could almost trace it to the early and late Wittgenstein. So I don't want to get too obscure here with you, but the early Wittgenstein was, I guess, wrote one of the great works in positivism, where he had this correspondence view of language, right? Where something corresponds to the referent, corresponds to the thing it's referencing, right? So and they work their whole entire, so you could see it's very similar to what we were talking about with trust. There is something called trust. We can measure it. Right. Versus the later Wittgenstein, who focused on language games, focused on context. Things have meaning in a context. We look at local diversity. We look at, all right. So here's a situation, Recker, where you and I are discussing positivism and interpretivism. Neither of us prepared like usual. And we're showing up here and we're talking about it. So we understand that there's this difference. We understand that, interpretivism is about meaning. It's subjective. We understand positivism is more about trying to take away a lot of the variation and get at the essence of things and look at regularities across those essences, I guess is one way to think about it. Right. And I think the problem with a lot of this philosophy of science epistemology stuff in our field and in organizational research is this. Number one, it doesn't matter anymore, right? We're all trained in this. And then I'm going to tell you why it doesn't matter. I think that these debates have been around long enough for us to, everyone, even the most positivistic person that, I mean, I wrote a qualitative research paper and I'm here in an analytics department with a bunch of quants and computer scientists, right? Every one of them appreciates that there is value to qualitative case-based research, right? And every one of us who are doing the kind of, and I was raised in kind of an interpretive tradition, and I understand that I'm generating theory from my interpretations, and that these theories are tentative. They're, but I'm not just doing pure description. If you look at some of the early interpretivists and a lot of the real hardcore subjectivists, pure description is certainly something they think is a legitimate contribution, and it might be in certain situations. But the fact is, in organizational research, we need to come up with theory or extend theory or with our qualitative work, or else we're not. And then the moment you're speaking in terms of theory, you're speaking in terms of regularities, and in the end, we're kind of all positivists from that standpoint, right?
Okay, let me share a personal view on this, because what you say actually resonates with me a lot. Because see, I got trained you were trained in an interpretive sense. I got trained in positivist training, right? Even the case study qual work was positivist. Yeah. So we always thought of, measurable concepts that are out there, and then we had to figure out a way of actually, getting data on them and reasoning about them and so forth. Even in qualitative, so independent whether we were quantitative and quantitative was sort of the gold standard, always the ends to which we wanted to get to, right? So I did this for a while, and I kind of enjoyed it as well. And then at some stage I decided, well, I really want to, get my hands dirty, interpretive, just try it out. I wanted to see what that looks like and how that feels like. And at that time, because I was also trained in that tradition where people said, you have to take a stance. You have to be either this or that. You can't be both. Right. And I felt, why not? I can change my view. Why not? I can do interpretive work. Right. So I never felt for me personally that it would change how I look at the world. It wouldn't change the world for me. For me, these were both tools to look at the world differently. Right. So one of the first pieces of really interpretive work was actually the work with our friend Stefan on sense making. That was an interpretive case study. Right. So I felt, well, why not? Right. It was difficult for me to get into this. Right. It was very different writing, very different analysis strategies and so forth. Quite enjoyable. But in the back end of my head, the positivist in me always thought this is going to be so difficult to measure. If I wanted to test that theory, then it's going to be so goddamn hard. Yep. Right. But at the time, a lot of people always said, and they still do, I guess, it's how can you do both? You can't do both.
so I think that there's an answer, right? And I think that the answer existed about 50 years before these debates even started. And the problem is that for whatever reason, people didn't read them, or Europeans didn't read it at all, but Americans probably should have and didn't. And it's the American pragmatist position. Right.
Oh, of course.
And of course. And it's William James, it's Charles Sanders Peirce. And for them, the problem, I think, with this whole idea of positivism and then the need for interpretivism, and then we have critical realism, which is the realistic, but we understand the world's interpreted. So we have these kind of
layers,
three layered process. And so that's another way. The only reason we have all this navel gazing around positivism, interpretivism, and critical realism and all that is because we put theory up on a pedestal. We think that we will come up with the once and for all right answer. And our once and for all right answer better be really faithful to the interpreted reality of humans, right? Or it has to be really faithful to the regularities that are across patterns of activity, or whatever. And so our dispositions take us one way or another. And William James talked about this. He talked about the tough-minded empiricists, right? These are the people who are facts, give me more facts. And then he compared that to the tender-minded idealists who are not only maybe the ethicists, but also the ones who looked for broad regularities. These were the theorists, right? And it doesn't quite fit the positivist interpretive mold, although you might be able to see that. What's really interesting is a lot of times it's the positivists that are the tough-minded, but then they're the ones who are abstracting up to theory and thinking that there are broad regularities, whereas the The interpretivists are the ones who are really about the empirical little reality and all that sort of thing. But William James basically argued and said, well, the problem is it's all good, right? We want, and he even said this, we want facts, of course, give us more facts. And we want ideas, of course, give us more ideas. They're both good. The problem is that when we give one primacy over the other, and the problem is when we think that our theory, our hypothesis is final. Our hypothesis is never final. If we take a humble view of hypotheses and say each hypothesis we have is wrong, each theory that we have is wrong, the question is it useful for a purpose? Can we use it? Is it the best of our thinking at a time right now for answering a question we have right now? And if so, that's the best theory we have, but we know it's probably going to be wrong and we go forward. So it becomes far less about, am I right in this answer somehow definitively, more of like, is this useful at the current moment to answer this particular question?
See, I have two thoughts on this, right? So like, remind me if I forget the second one, because I want to start with the first. I think I also have always taken a pragmatist view on this epistemology question of positivism versus interpretivism, but I never linked it to theory and it being on a pedestal. To me, to this point, I think this is just a question of that derives from a research question, from the problem you want to solve. I think that some problems lend themselves dominantly to a positivist strategy just as much as to an interpretive strategy, right? If I want to figure out if more digitalization leads to better performance, I think that's a positivist question. Like, I want to use positivist tools to answer that. So not in a black or white, but it's sort of like in a tendency type of the way. And if I want to figure out how people imbue meaning into digitalized products and how that might be different from physical products beforehand, that sounds like that could be an interpretive strategy, could be very useful to tackle that question. You know what I mean? Like, to me, it's dependent on the problem that I want to focus. And then I'm looking at these worldview and the associated toolkits.
So that's kind of a contingency. That's like the contingency.
Yeah, but it's also pragmatic in a way, because it's a question of neither is right or wrong. Some of them are more useful to the question that I'm asking.
Yeah, absolutely. And the problem with those contingency ideas is that, and I forget which one it was, but someone would say, you can answer a what question, positivist, why question, interpret. But then I'm like, well, that's weird, because what is also descriptive without necessarily explaining why, or you can find a mechanism in quantitative and identify. So there are these pat ways of thinking about when to use one versus the other, and they've never worked for me. But what you're saying is, I agree with in principle. And that's like, what's your question? Answer your question, right? And use the method that answers your question.
Yeah. Also, it's not a question of right or wrong. It's a question of more or less useful. And that if you go back, especially in our own field in the 80s and 90s, where you had some of these paradigms they never wrote it in that sense. They literally talked about right and wrong. The positivist is saying the interpretive got it wrong. The interpretive people said the positivist got it wrong. Yeah. None of them said like, well, it's useful, because as students you ask useful, you got to ask useful for what? What are you trying to do here? And then I can tell you whether that model, you said theory, which is a model, or I would say a strategy as a means, as a method, as a procedure, would get you there, right? So that to me is the essence of pragmatism, to always ask, what's the useful thing to do right now?
Yeah. And then I think that, absolutely. And I think that, and it's useful for a purpose, right? There's not some useful, and this always drives me nuts.
Purpose. Yeah.
This always drives me nuts and it's usually like people with a more interpretive bent, I think, that write these like qualitative, exploratory kind of analyses, where they'll say, oh, and here's a useful framework for such and such. And then they go on and say I used institutional theory. Institutional theory has been shown to be a useful framework for understanding implementation. And then they go on.
That's not a good argument for anything.
It's anything. Like useful for what, right? You said for studying. All right, great. But useful for answering which type of question, right? There's always useful for a purpose, not just useful in some general sense, right?
It's funny because I always think when I read these sentences, I always think that I don't care that it has been proven useful for whatever questions and applications people used it for. That does not mean it's going to be useful to what you're doing right here, right?
You have to tell us why. Yeah.
You have to tell us why. There's no determinism or strong sequence just because it worked in the past or for that question or that, context here does not guarantee it's the same here. So I always thought that's always a weak argument to use. Just because people have been doing stuff doesn't mean we need to continue doing this.
Yeah.
So,
but you've even mentioned, oh, okay. Yeah. I want to hear your second.
It's a bit of a tangent. Yeah. Because you talked about the empiricist and the idealist and sort of what do we put on a pedestal? So this is what I sometimes think about. So I think business school. So forget about IS, sort of business school. So what is the epitome of what we're doing? Yeah, the Michael Porters of this world, etc. These are people that come up with ideas. Yep, ideas that help managers do their business and manage the organization and do all these sorts of things. A lot of that is based on ideas, not on facts, I think. And a lot of the people that really everyone, the big great minds, there are ideas people. They're not empiricists. Yeah. So, and sometimes I'm a little bit sad because I like to be an empiricist. And then I often think, well, I'm in the wrong field for this.
Well, when you say an empiricist, what do you mean?
I mean the people that go out and study and show what is. Descriptive. Yeah. It's sort of like, okay, that are fact finders and say, I've mapped out the world. I've mapped out the business landscape. If you want to go closer to IS, I mapped out all the ways in organizations use technology, and it's this. And it's a giant table, and here's a fraction, here's a percentage, and here's just data, here's just facts,
Yeah.
And we don't do this a lot. And in general, I think business school research doesn't do this a lot. Yeah. So we're more in the business of coming with ideas. We want to have the 5 forces frameworks. We want to have the idea of disruptive innovation. We want to have strategic competition. I don't know, many of them are really just ideas. Some of them are backed by data.
Well, all right. So I think you're being unfair. You mentioned disruptive innovation. And of course that finds its roots in Trumpeter, which arguably Trumpeter was an empiricist. Trumpeter was the father of econometrics, right? He started econometrica. And his whole argument was, you economists are full of shit. I don't know if you know this. Trumpeter was hired at Harvard as a economic historian, right? He was well known for, I guess, a book he wrote on and people didn't really care about his ideas. He was around the time of Keynes. Everybody was enamored with Keynes because Keynes was giving them some kind of macro economic prescriptive advice, whereas Trumpeter had this descriptive view of the world, his, his creative destruction ideas and some of his entrepreneurship ideas. And these were uncomfortable. Economists wanted to study things in equilibrium. He argued that, studying equilibrium when there's never an empirical equilibrium is crazy. People argued at his time, and it's an argument that's happening right now. He said that if we look at the working man, their wages haven't changed in 30 years. And Trumpeter would go crazy. He'd be like, go look at a working man's house. All right. 30 years ago, and he's writing in 1920, he's like, 30 years ago, they didn't have a toilet in their house or running water. Now, every single one of them has a toilet and running water in their house. 30 years ago, they were stitching together their one pair of boots that they wore to. Now they each have 5 pairs of boots that they buy at the local store. The life of a working man, he argued, was qualitatively different. I don't care what your silly economic models say. This is the reality. So he was very much, his whole ideas of disruptive innovation were empirical reality. And then you look at Christensen, and you could trace the lineage from Trumpeter to Utterbach to Abernathy to Christensen. Christensen looked at the disk drive industry, and he was arguing for why disk drives, and then he came up with the disruption idea. So first of all, I would argue that a lot of these ideas are rooted in empirics, but the interesting thing, and this is actually one of the big points that our little editorial is getting at, is you can actually frame the empirical reality a bunch of different ways. And you could use Trumpeter as this, right? Some people are looking at the same empirical reality and saying that the working man's wages didn't change in 30 years. Trumpeter looks at it and saying the working man's wages changed in 30 years. They're both looking at the same reality. They're measuring it in different ways, one with numbers, another with looking at their houses, whatever it is they're doing. But I think the point is this, that there's no way we could understand the fullness of empirical reality. There's just too much going on. So we always have to take a simplification and look at that simplification, right?
So yeah, my mind is wandering a little bit. I like what I heard you say was that what we're doing at the moment is we can blend positivism, interpretivism in the very simple way, right? So it's probably not very truthful, but in a simple way of saying, like, look, we can grab measurable facts about reality, very traditional positivism. Like, let's go and grab some facts about things we can measure. But even if we do, we can interpret them much differently. And depending on how we do, we see, one person sees a pattern where the other one sees the anti-pattern, right? Or someone doesn't see anything, the other person sees this. Or one person says, like, it's all been the same. The other one, no, it's all qualitatively different. Is that what he's saying? It's sort of like a blend.
Well, so let's just look at Trumpeter, just because he's someone I'm familiar with. I read his biography and his books, and I'm a big fan. He has a article, we should post it on our notes, that talks about econometrics as the way economics should go, right? Because a lot of economics was kind of empirical, but in a very broad brush manner. And he's like, we need to go get the facts as they present themselves in the world. And we need to go see what the world actually says, not our equilibrium models, right? So he has this nice chapter where he argues in defense of econometrics as an approach. And what I think is really interesting is the econometrics approach is that it's very much, at least in his way of describing it, is very much like an interpretive approach, right? In the sense, and we usually don't think of the two together, but it's in the sense of, I'm going out and looking at the real world to see what the real world says and what's out there by the things that are present in and I'm not putting my little imaginary concepts and all that around it. So he's kind of the hard empiricist that I would argue is very similar to, Van Manen's idea of going and looking at wherever a police force is and sitting with policemen and riding along to see what's actually happening there. Right. So I think the intuition is very similar, which is, let's go look at the world and do that. The problem with looking at the world is that at one point you have to step back and draw a conclusion. At one point you have to step back and make some sort of assertion, some sort of understanding. And the moment you make a statement of understanding or an assertion is the moment you're simplifying the messiness of the real world. And the moment you simplify, you're abstracting away, you're doing a Porter's five forces, you're doing a Christensen's model of disruption, whatever it is you're doing, now you immediately have to abstract. You're forgetting a lot of what you saw because you're constructing essentially an argument, right?
So what you're saying is abstraction is modeling, right? Modeling is extraction, and that is necessarily interpretation. And theorizing is interpretation as well. Isn't it the same as even the positivists camp post Karl Popper? Yeah, they basically also said, look, there's no straight positivism. It's impossible, right? You can't measure things. As soon as you measure things, you're influencing the world, right? Heisenberg. So, they can't, in even a measure of a measurable thing is a social construction. There's no such a thing the world doesn't come in attributes. Attributes is something that we assign to them. So it's already an act of interpretation.
Well, all right. So first of all, I agree with you, but I don't think that's what they said. So we're going to get into hair splitting. I think that a lot of folks think that there is a kind of ontological significance to a lot of concepts. They think there is something called trust. And our measures are approximating trust imperfectly, and there's a lot of measurement error and whatever. But they're assuming there is a thing called trust. That's a much different than what you're saying and what I'm saying, which is kind of the pragmatist position, saying, and this is William James, his famous buzzing, blooming confusion or whatever he called it, right? Where he said the world is just flux. There's a recent paper actually by some folks.
By Lucas Introna.
Yeah, Introna and his, where they talk about Beigi, flux. But that's very much a Jamesian view. It's that it's flux. It's this melting, boiling, bubbling reality. And then what we do is grab some portion of that bubbling, boiling reality and call it something, right? There's no ontological significance to the thing we're calling it. We give it that, we give it a name, and then we measure it, the name we give it. And that name is fairly arbitrary, right? And then the social construction element is those arbitrary names we give them, get objective significance over time in themselves, right?
Okay, so can we do a little mental exercise yet? Like you and I, we didn't really prepare for this. We wanted to talk about something different. At all. No, we wanted to talk about a different topic, but then like literally 1 minute before we started recording, we decided to talk about positivism, interpretivism. But since we do, so you know Plato, the Plato dialogue, and this sort of the shadow of the horse in the cave, and how do we know that there's a horse, right? Basically. So link that back to positivism and interpretivism. Like how does it? I always wondered about this.
Let me give you my agenda real quick before because here's the deal. I think that interpretivism and positivism, first of all, are misunderstood. In that I think people who are not interpretivists think that they're interpretivists, and then they turn around and try and make regularities, right? But they think because they're doing qualitative and because they've read Foucault or something that they're somehow interpretivists, right? And then they turn around, establish regularities, make assertions about those regularities, and act as if there's ontological significance in things, and don't spend a lot of time with subjective interpretations, right? So most people who think of themselves as interpretivists aren't particularly interpretive beyond understanding that they're interpreting their situation. Similarly, I think most positivists, or people we would attribute positivism, understand that they're dealing with constructions, that they're dealing with subjective realities and all of that. I think the whole idea of positivism and interpretivism is losing its salience. But here's my agenda. The problem is that we tend to roll one up. And although you said you did a positivist case study and all that, and the fact is we generally think of them as qualitatives, a little more interpretive, quantitative and positivist, and there's a certain masculinity maybe to positivism. I'm doing math, right? So quantitative generally falls on that side. What I think's happening, and what our future podcasts and what our session, and we should post for people to sign up for the session. It's going to be in April, and it's a computationally intensive theory construction, is this idea that now we don't just have econometrics or surveys and experiments, and then on the other hand, interviews, and we have computational stuff at our fingers. So much of what we're doing is using digital technologies. So people are doing, like you've done simulations, that's computational stuff. There's trace data. There's all this stuff out there in the world that we can, there's video, there's text, there's all this. It's blurring the lines between qualitative and quantitative, right? We can use that stuff in our qualitative paradigms and our quantitative paradigms. So what's happening is research is heading in a direction that all these old, tired epistemological positions are gone. And the only epistemological position left is pragmatism, which is saying, yes, it's a blooming, buzzing confusion. We have to construct little ways of making sense of it, just like Trumpeter did. We have to say this is what's happening, and then know that we're probably wrong, but it's the best we have at any point. And all our little constructions, the patterns that we elicit and then make arguments out of, are tentative.
Okay, let me play that back a little bit. There's a lot of points you just made, right? So one of them, just a little bit of context for the listeners. So the Quarterly has been running workshops, first for the editorial board on certain advances to just make sure everyone gets on board. But it's not limited to editors. There's also a public version for authors, right? And the latest one, the ones that you referred to, was on computationally intensive theory development, right? And so I was a part of that editor session last week, really interesting. And the public one, sort of for prospective authors and authors, will be in April, right? And we're going to put up the links. And that I can only encourage everyone to go there. That's fantastic. It's really novel stuff. So I wanted to make one point about this. So I was in this session last week, and I at some stage smiled at it because I felt like, wow, you give a name to something that a lot of people have been doing for a long time now. Yeah. So make that concrete. So you mentioned like simulation-based theorizing. So sort of when you use simulation, not as a, I always say, a weak form of evaluating, but really as a means to generate theory. What does it mean? What does it play out in practice? It means that you simulate the hell out of your data. You ran thousands of simulations and you tweak the parameters and you just have a look until you get something, some model, something that you can reason about, right? So I agree that's what some people are doing. And I also, in one of the early episodes, I mentioned to you that I wrote a computationally intensive paper over 10 years ago, which doesn't get any traction because back then it wasn't a thing, right? So we did text mining around 2009 or 10 with a tool called Leximancer.
LDA.
Yeah. LDA and Leximancer, both in the same paper. Our idea was very humble. We wanted to just to see how Leximancer, which is basically computationally generating concept maps, and LDA what the differences are in these two procedural methods. The
Yeah.
funny thing was that was a special issue on quantitative methods. So we wrote a paper on using quantitative methods for qualitative stuff, like text analysis. That was the idea, right? Anyway, so we did this back then. There's not the word computational in there and so forth, but it was the same thing. So this tool, Leximancer, is parsing text and generate concept maps of the prevalent themes and the connection to other themes like love and hate and friendship and whatnot, right? But you have to interpret, you have to work with these maps, right? So you have to, if you wanted to develop a theory from that, you can't just take that output and chuck it in the paper and off you go, right? It's just a tool, and you had to theorize with it. So it's computationally intensive theory development.
Exactly.
Right. So,
but now we're not calling it development anymore. And we had this debate. We call it construction. And the reason we call it construction is because we wanted to emphasize that it's a constructive act. You're constructing an argument, right? And really that's the pragmatist position. Every hypothesis, every theory is nothing more than a construction. It's something we're saying. It's an argument we're constructing. It's a belief, right, that we have, and we know we're wrong. This is the key, the fallibilism of pragmatism that I think is the key, is that every time we make a construction, we know it's imperfect, so it's not the end all right answer, and we know it's wrong in some way, but it's an assertion. It's here. This is what the data is showing me. This is how I've simplified it using my model. This is what I'm saying. And I know other people will elaborate on it, will refute it, will extend it. But for the purpose that I did this is our best answer right now, right?
So the other point I wanted to comment in is you're saying like this distinction between positivism and interpretivism is sort of, you said lost salience. It basically becomes superfluous. I like that argument.
It's nonsense. I'm going to say right now, right now, nonsense, right? This qualitative, quantitative, I guess matters a bit. But certainly interpretive positivist, total and utter nonsense right now. I don't think we even need to talk about it.
Well, yeah, I like that very much. And it reminds me of this distinction between research methods and quantitative with the qualitative, where people have been saying for years, look, these old traditions, these old silos, they're irrelevant and we don't even want them anymore. And I think that's a very useful attitude to also have towards the positivism versus interpretivism. In other words, don't give me this subsection in your paper where you argue this and this particular thing is your stance. Like it probably isn't. You probably got it wrong. And third, even if not, who cares? Like it doesn't matter.
Here's how to write every paper going forward. All right. This is it. It's got to have these 4 components. The first is, what is my question? Second is, okay, how have other smart people answered my question? Right? That's your conversance. Then either you do your analysis and that analysis can be an empirical analysis or whatever, you problematize what other people are saying and you do your analysis and then you conclude with your argument. And your argument is your construction that comes from your analysis that extends the people you were talking to and improves. It either extends what they have to say. It has some implication on what they have to say. I like the idea of visualizing what they have to say. They've said it, but they had no evidence. You're showing evidence. I think that could be a contribution.
Okay. I want to tweak that a little bit. I like this very much, right? But let's say, don't start with the question. Start, what's the problem? What's the problem? What's the problem you're addressing, right? Could be a question. It doesn't have to be a question. Like I've seen too many people say like, this paper doesn't have a research question. Well, who cares?
Point. All right. I'm with you. You sold me.
Here's a problem. Tell me what the conversation is that is dealing with this and how you're fitting into this conversation.
And what their conclusions are.
And now here's where I depart a little bit. Tell me whether your theory is your starting point and you go from there, or whether theory is your end point. Yeah, in the old tradition, whether you're working deductively or inductively. I don't want to call it that because there's also other facets, but I want to know.
All right, this is our next talk, though. Yeah.
Yeah, so you see where I'm getting at. Do you want to make the argument that we don't know, and I'm constructing, generating, developing theory, whether it's inductively or abductively, I don't care. But tell me whether that's the end point or whether that was your starting point. I think that's an interesting one because that tells me how the rest of the paper is going to play out. Yeah. And then, do your thing, show me your findings, show me the implications, done.
So, yeah. All right. So this is what we're saying. We're coming up with our formulation on how to write a paper.
Every paper.
Every paper. regardless, none of this positive interpretive, right? You start with the problem. That could be a question. It could be whatever. Then you address the people talking about this problem and what they've concluded, right? And then I guess you can take two paths, right? One is you problematize that in an open-ended way and then do analysis, either empirical or conceptual, in order to generate an answer. Or the other is you think about it and hypothesize some answers, and then you use your analysis to test your hypotheses, right? So that would be inductive or deductive in your approach. And then in the end, you come up with a construction that's humble, tentative, and extends the conversation of those people you look to extend that are addressing that particular problem, right? And maybe look for some broader integrations because there are other people addressing similar problems or something like that. You do that in the back end. We take that out of the front end of the paper, right? That's out of the critical path of your contribution, because your contribution is to something. It's never a universal contribution. It's always a contribution to something. And the thing you're contributing to is a conversation going on among people that are addressing your problem, right?
And I think if you think about papers this way, I think it even sets the stage for what you earlier called the empiricist way, the fact-finding descriptive way. Maybe the problem is that we don't know. And one way of solving that problem would be just, okay, well, one of the things we need to grab some facts here. So that's what we're doing, right? And maybe the paper can stop there. That's a separate discussion, but I think it can stop there. Or I think what you said last week was a little bit about, well, maybe it's enough for us to show and describe certain patterns that we see in the data about the reality. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it doesn't have to be a full-blown theory, whatever that's supposed to mean, but maybe it's enough to see patterns. Yeah, because for some problems might be a really good way towards an answer.
That's a contribution. Yeah, so we drew on Tawana's paper, and I think, was it Tawana and Bush or Tawana and Kim? And we'll put it up, but he has this idea that it's
the bricks, not walls.
An edifice. Yeah. And if we just write these bricks that are off by themselves, those are less useful than if we write bricks. Each paper is a brick in an edifice, right? And then the edifice is what matters, not each brick. And in the article, he's lamenting that we're a field of a whole bunch of bricks. Oh, there's blockchain. Now let's write something about blockchain. Oh, look, there's VR. Let's write something about VR. And no one's connecting all these. He has this idea of strong inference, which is essentially cumulative tradition he's arguing for, which is, come on, let's try to be less grand. Let's be more humble and small bricks, but let's put them in an edifice. And then eventually we'll have, and in his article, it's this nomological net, right? This edifice of understanding a phenomenon from a certain perspective. And he has a particular view of the world, but I think that metaphor of brick and edifice, where each paper is just a little brick, is a good way of thinking about it, right?
It is. I mean, also, I got reminded of your meta-analysis paper, your qualitative meta-analysis paper. I happened to read that yesterday. And I was thinking, well, what you did is you try to take 26 bricks. I think you had 26 papers or 36 or something that you looked at. These are all bricks, right? And you see what edifice they're constructing together, right? If you put them all together, is it a house or is it two houses? Is it a street? What is the building that is being erected through the 36 papers on enterprise systems implementation?
That's a good point. We can actually use different things as bricks. But anyway, listen, that's all I really wanted to talk about today, is maybe set the stage and throw that out there that, this positive interpretive thing first of all. And what's really interesting is American pragmatism existed before positivism and interpretivism had their heydays. And I really wonder if people would have just read Charles Sanders Peirce and William James, and they have different perspectives on these things. It's not like the two of them are perfectly in sync, but the general idea is, look, you're making an assertion. That's an assertion of belief. That's all a hypothesis is, and you're wrong. The question is, how good is it for now? How good? Like Newton was wrong, right? Apparently, from some universal sense, Newton's physics was wrong, but using Newton's physics, we can go to the moon and we can build bridges and we can do all sorts of things. So in some universal sense, it's wrong, but in reality, it was pretty damn right useful, enough for us. Yeah.
So before we end, like Charles Sanders Peirce, See, I read him, but I read him because I started with conceptual modeling, and
So
I always
semiotics, right?
exactly. So I
Yeah.
always associated him with semiotics in the same sense that I also came across Wittgenstein, the early and the late, because correspondence theory of truth, and then
Yeah.
later is sort of like okay, symbol and referent, blah blah blah. See, that's the funny thing. Conceptual modeling, everyone thinks that's a niche topic, etc. I think it's pretty deep topic when you get into the bottom of what are we modeling, what is a model, is it a
Yeah.
representation, what are we representing, and so forth. So
No, you're right.
yeah, so but it's funny, like what I wanted to ask you, you always bring him up as a pragmatist. I always thought, well, that's one of the guys in semiotics. Yeah,
Well,
Peirce,
so
Seal, Echo, these people.
yeah, I mean, so Charles Sanders Peirce, and you really, so the book I would recommend everybody to get into American pragmatism is a book that's not even so much about American pragmatism, but about American pragmatists. So it's called The Metaphysical Club. And oh no, I forgot the name of the author, but he's a famous guy. And he has a reader with it where he grabs some essays. And this actually talks about the people. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was the Supreme Court Justice, William James, Charles Sanders Peirce, John Dewey. These are the famous American pragmatists. Other pragmatists are like Mead, and there are a bunch of them. But I would argue you could trace Herb Simon to William James directly. You could trace C. West Churchman to William James directly, Carl Weick to William James directly. And the way I look at it, and this is my little construction of American pragmatism, and if people are interested, maybe we can do a future podcast on American pragmatism.
No. This is it. This is enough.
This is it. This is last time. I could do it all day, but the way I look at it is this. William James was the great popularizer of the idea, but Charles Sanders Peirce was the intellect. Charles Sanders Peirce was a physical and emotional wreck, but he was brilliant. He was a statistician. He was a semiotician. He was an energizer bunny of all sorts of new ideas, and he was brilliant. And he was possibly one of, and there are books out there. Cambridge Pragmatism is another book that traces Wittgenstein to Peirce, right, through a guy named Ramsey. Ramsey read Peirce, and that's what changed Wittgenstein from the early to the late Wittgenstein. All right. So Habermas, according to my advisor, Kalle Luutinen, he says that the two philosophers that we're going to remember from the 20th century are Wittgenstein and Habermas. If you read Habermas from Opel, I just read his biography that you gave me. He brought in American pragmatism. American pragmatism influenced Habermas's entire tradition, right? And when I say American pragmatism, I really mean Charles Sanders Peirce's ideas that were then processed by other people. So I would actually argue one of the most brilliant people that defined 20th century philosophy and thinking was Charles Sanders Peirce, not just in semiotics, not just in epistemology, but in a lot of different domains. He was one of the great people. And I think in the last decade, we're only beginning to realize that, right? So
I think, he was a guy, given that he was influential in many ideas, another name that pops up for me in the semiotics area is Umberto Eco, right? But he was also a great writer. He wrote great novels. These are the great scholars, that you're aspiring to be, are they not?
So first of all, I agree. Umberto Eco is cool because he writes like fiction. He's creative. He's clever, but he is like a little tiny ant compared to the giant that is Charles Sanders Peirce, right? As I mentioned, right, Charles Sanders Peirce, I think you could put him in the few names in the last 500 years of intellectual giants, right? He's next level. He's not on the level of Umberto Eco. Umberto Eco is fine. He's like what Foucault and half these other people that are like great. They have their little mark on the world, but no, I think Charles Sanders Peirce is next level, right? I don't know if we would put him up there with the Aristotle, but we'll put him up there in like the next category down, I guess. Yeah.
All right, folks, this episode will have a long reading list, probably the longest ones of our set of episodes so far. And I expect every one of you to read all these books by the next time we have the next show. Nick, it was good talking to you. And
hey, Wrecker, thanks for letting me run my mouth about epistemology, and I won't do it again. And if we do it again, I'll prepare though before that.
I'm looking forward to the comments because I'm pretty sure we got some things wrong, and I'm pretty sure some people would strongly disagree. For example, we have not once talked about critical realism as the weak attempt of bridging these two traditions. That's how I see it.
That's all we did. Oh, critical realists are going to hate us.
All right, Nick, good talking to you. See you next time.